The erotic thriller is a subgenre long thought to have gone extinct. Once a money-making staple of the industry that started its rise in the late 80s with the smash hit Fatal Attraction, that introduced a largely conservative, Reagan-era audience to this new way of presenting racy material through a more mainstream, prestige lens. Adrian Lyne's film really opened the door for the genre to then flourish throughout the 90s, with films like Sleeping with the Enemy, Basic Instinct, and Indecent Proposal, just to name a few, dominating the box office. The erotic thriller's demise more or less came at the start of the 2000s, fittingly sputtering out after the release of Adrian Lyne's Unfaithful in 2002, a film that Babygirl actually feels closely related to in some ways. In the early aughts, these major studios and the major stars these films were carried on the back of now all but turned away from the kinds of grown-up, titillating neo-noirs that were once a box office goldmine, to now turn their attention to major franchise films, which is what we're still clinging on to today. There of course have been some attempts to resurrect it recently, with rather pale imitations of their predecessors. We're talking about the painfully watered-down, quote-unquote erotic dramas like Saltburn, Deep Water, or the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy, trying to recapture some of that kinky magic, but falling flat on their face. Enter Babygirl, the third feature film from writer-director Halina Reijn, following up her 2019 debut Instinct and the 2022 horror comedy hit Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Fronted by the great Nicole Kidman, who is of course very familiar with eroticism in her work, and young talent / heartthrob Harris Dickinson, Babygirl follows Kidman's Romy Mathis, a CEO of a robotics company. The film introduces us to her in her private life, having sex with her husband, played by Antonio Banderas. We watch as she rides him until he reaches completion and she fakes an orgasm. Following this, she wanders off to another room of the house where she watches porn on her laptop and begins to pleasure herself. But we then see, in her professional life, Romy as this powerful chief executive, someone who is impenetrable and stately. The people around her are always left on their toes due to her cold, unreadable demeanor. But she has something eating away at her, that deep-seated desire to be controlled, told exactly what to do. Something that a woman in such a position of power is not allowed to entertain in any way, for fear that position be stripped away from her. But into her life strolls Dickinson's Samuel, awakening that very idea deep inside of her. What's to come unravels from there. This idea of control is at the very center of Reijn's film, and I think at the center of most classic erotic thrillers to some extent. But she takes this exhaustively used idea that largely zeroes in on male gratification over a woman's, and subverts that. In her movie, it's the woman whose gratification is placed front and center, and the male counterpart, if any pleasure is indeed derived, is relegated to our imagination and played entirely off-screen. Reijn uses that well-trodden power imbalance between a CEO and her intern as a vehicle to extract this idea, as her central character, Romy, being a wealthy and powerful woman, has these set ways in which to maintain her controlled lifestyle. We see her engage in an assortment of regimens, Botox injections, cryotherapy, plunge pool sessions. Samuel then enters her life and obliterates that carefully constructed existence. Their relationship is dangerous, almost constantly teetering on the edge of utter ruin, because as we are all aware, a CEO having sexual relations with a much younger intern, if found out, would have devastating consequences, not only ruining her career, but her family as well. They each hold the key to one another's ruin at the tips of their fingers, and that's clearly part of the pleasure for both of them. Simply from the way Reijn is toying with the form and tropes of the erotic thriller, we can gather that she understands these kinds of films so well, and also knows the expectations that many viewers are going into a film like Babygirl with. She knows most of us are at least familiar with the cliches of the genre, the largely similar shape many of these films take, whether it's Fatal Attraction, A Perfect Murder, or Disclosure, and with that, she carefully toes the line between one of those cheap and pedestrian erotic thrillers you discover on the dusty shelves at the video store, only to take a hard left and steer the material in some shockingly mature and thorny directions that kind of speaks directly to a lot of the online discourse around sex scenes and erotic cinema in general. A filmmaker you can't help but think of while watching a movie with this kind of subject matter is the legendary Paul Verhoeven, a filmmaker that, incidentally, Reijn worked with as an actress on his criminally underseen World War II film Black Book. But the film of Verhoeven's most closely related to Babygirl is his 2016 Isabelle Huppert vehicle, Elle, that similarly explore older women in chief executive positions, engaging in rather complicated and problematic affairs. Elle is of course much more transgressive and really seeks to discomfit the viewer, as is the Verhoeven trademark. whereas Babygirl's chief concern is of pleasure, imbuing every moment with such a playful energy, every scene so sexually charged that even the non-sex scenes feel kind of arousing. It is lent such an atmosphere by Cristobal Tapia de Vere's breathy score and Jasper Wolf's intoxicating images, but it's obviously due in large part to the electric chemistry between Kidman and Dickinson, who feed off one another so brilliantly. Kidman's slim frame and icy personality colliding with Dickinson's boyish, domineering demeanor. Her voraciously hungry, carnal desires find a perfect match in this young intern who, whether it's performative or not, is there to fill the void of that stern, masculine figure she wants in her life. He's essentially nothing more than a manifestation of Romy's deepest, darkest desires, going so far to the fact that we learn nothing about Samuel outside of his sexual affairs with Romy. No backstory, no ulterior motives, just a brooding vessel for pleasure. The film also leaves Samuel mostly clothed, never really exposed throughout the film, while Romy is completely naked, bearing it all emotionally and physically throughout the film. If it weren't for her work in films like Birth, Eyes Wide Shut, or Dogville, I'd say Kidman's turn as Romy would be the finest work of her illustrious career. But regardless, it's a fearless, vulnerable performance from one of our great actresses, in a role that we just don't get to see many female performers do in this stage of their careers. The dance these two brilliant performers are engaging in here, the constant push-pull of their energies, is a real pleasure to behold, that single-handedly manages to keep the film from treading into much more pedestrian thriller territory, and instead enter the realm of something much more smart, sexy, funny, and bold than I ever expected. Just how refreshing this is. A movie about sexual fulfillment and behavior, about complicated, semi-problematic relationships that doesn't feel the need to moralize or over-explain it all. Sex is allowed to just exist and be sex, in all of its sometimes transactional, transient nature, where there is a meeting of the body that fulfills both of the parties in some way, without being bogged down by trauma narratives or some kind of irreparable damage, like we used to get all of the time, until Hollywood turned away from the sexed up and moved toward the sexless. Babygirl almost seems like a giant middle finger to the kind of puritanical ideas now seeping across the cultural landscape once again, almost mirroring exactly what that initial wave of erotic thrillers were made in response to, archaic Reagan-era politics and the fear of AIDS in the late 80s. Today, so many films and their makers want to sidestep anything remotely controversial to please all four quadrants of movie audiences, when that's just not practical whatsoever. Babygirl, on the other hand, knows exactly what it's doing and who it's aiming towards, and leans incredibly hard into that. Reijn even directly comments on the discourse in the film when one character remarks to another that their views of sex and sexuality are dated. While it's a pretty direct, on-the-nose comment about the state of sex in media and society, it's refreshing to see a filmmaker thrash many people's puritanical, outdated views on sexual behavior, in a kind of movie that those same people would likely be outraged by. Mainstream films are reaching a point where they are afraid of crossing some imaginary boundary, letting a bunch of people on the internet dictate the content of their work. And that's why films like Babygirl, like this year's Anora, are important to lift up, as they present free, unsanitized images of sex, of the human body, because these filmmakers definitely understand that sex scenes, images of bodies, don't only have to exist as means of moving the plot forward, an idiotic, well-trodden talking point by so many online, but can serve to key us into a character's actions, their desires, and provide access into emotions only an act like sex can bring out. I'm well aware that this may seem like the ramblings of one horny cinephile, but I genuinely do think the erotic thriller is an important fixture of the film industry that needs to make a return, because we don't have many moderate to big-budget films geared specifically toward adults, made by high-end filmmakers and led by true blue movie stars anymore. And I think the erotic thriller can fill that void yet again, can reach the heights of what it once was in this new era of movie making and movie watching. So I'm begging, pleading, that Babygirl marks the next beginning to having really attractive people engaging in titillating mysteries, sometimes silly, moral, and ethical dilemmas, and most importantly, just having sex on the big screen again. Is that really too much to ask?